The Christian purity movement promoted a strict view of abstinence before marriage. But 2 decades later, some followers are grappling with unforeseen aftershocks.
Mental health experts have begun to accurately classify the effect of purity culture as a specific form of PTSD. So why on earth were we taking advice from a 21-year-old homeschooled virgin anyway? The stress and anxiety you may feel as a Christian about dating and sexuality could be traced back to, not the Bible, but the teachings of this book.
Talking about pleasure is really taboo. We don't talk about sex for pleasure, especially if we're teaching sex ed to younger people. We view it through this bad, scary lens.
Well, have you heard about this? More than 50% of African American teens are actually embracing abstinence. It is a significant increase from just 20 years ago, and celebrity role models like Megan Good and Russell Wilson's public declarations to wait until marriage are contributing to that increase.
That is definitely an upward trend. Karen Greer shows us how a local program is also helping by giving young girls the confidence to wait.
Sexuality is fluid. Sex doesn't make us whole. And so, how could you ever be broken?
We need to be having more conversations about common beliefs around sex, unpacking the stigma around sex, decreasing the amount of shame around sex and sexuality, and taking a more positive, inclusive, open-minded approach to what's happening in and out of the bedroom. It's important that we include sex education in our schools' curricula for the benefit of society. The attacks on sex education are particularly harmful for young people, their well-being, and their sexual health. We're going to hear from sex educator Erica Smith about what she sees in her work and why her work is so important, as well as unpack some of the stigmas around sex education.
Okay, so my name is Erica Smith, and I'm a sex educator, and I have done all kinds of different work in this field, but what I focus on the most is educating people who were raised in really high control religions about all of the sex ed that they missed growing up in that environment. I was raised what I would call very casually Christian, you know, like we never went to church. But I found that some of the people that need sex ed the most are people that were signing purity pledges and had all of the information kept from them, or were only given abstinence messaging, and also were given a lot of shame and fear and misinformation about sex. So a lot of my current work is really geared towards those people.
Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, went on to sell over 1 million copies. And as he and others pushed for purity, another more insidious message took root.
Well, ladies, I believe you also have a unique opportunity to protect the purity of your brothers in the Lord. Is how difficult it is for a guy to look at a girl with purity in his heart when she is dressed immodestly. You have no idea how difficult it is.
A purity pledge is something that has been asked of young people to do, where they basically sign a little piece of paper, a card that says, I will not have sex until marriage because I'm saving myself for my future spouse, and I will not disrespect myself or my future spouse. Like, that's the language that's often used. And purity pledges really rose to prominence in the 90s and early 2000s as part of this like big purity culture industry. And there were like purity balls and purity rings, and you know, this was primarily like in evangelical Christianity, and people signed a really popular one is the True Love Waits pledge. They had all kinds of, basically anyone sign it, all kids, but the general messaging of purity culture, I think, puts the biggest burden on girls, because they really straight up tell girls that you are a temptation and that you have to avoid being a temptation, because if you cause your brothers in Christ to stumble, meaning they look at you and they think about sex or want to have sex, then they are going to hell and you're responsible for that. That's like the explicit message. That's not even implied.
Wow, that gets an emotional reaction.
Yeah, it's really awful. We live in a very puritanical society in the United States. I think it's baked into the fabric of this country. And talking about pleasure is really taboo. We don't talk about sex for pleasure, especially if we're teaching sex ed to younger people. We view it through this bad, scary lens. So that means telling people all of the reasons that they should be afraid of sex and all of the terrible things that can happen, not talking about it in a positive way. It's really the difference between sex negativity, acting like sex is always going to be some risky, bad, scary thing that you do, or sex positivity, which is talking about sexuality like a healthy, normal part of life. We tend way more towards the sex negative, and there is a really big fear around talking about any kind of sexuality with young people. So yeah, pleasure is not often mentioned in sex ed. I believe it should be. One of my favorite quotes is from Dr. Eric Sprankel, who said, "Sex ed that only teaches about bad things is like a culinary school that only teaches about food poisoning." It's one of my faves. You know, in this country, there is such it's like a right-wing Christian stronghold on conversations about sexuality for all of us. Not just people that participate in the religion or are part of the church, but they want all of us to be very restrictive and afraid about sexuality. And it can be really difficult to have any conversation with young people about sex, let alone acknowledging that people do have sex because it feels good and because people like it. And including pleasure as part of a conversation does not include like explicitly telling young people, here are all the ways to do this. It means being super realistic and acknowledging like, this is why people do this. People do this because it feels good. Our bodies are designed to feel good in a certain way. And you know, there are age-appropriate ways to do this kind of teaching. It's very different when you're talking to a 5th grader than when you're talking to a 18-year-old. But leaving pleasure out of the conversation is absolutely just bonkers to me, because that is like the whole reason most people are having sex. And like sensuality, the good feelings that we get from sex and relationships, that's all part of pleasure. There has been a lot of research done over the years about comprehensive sex education versus abstinence-only education because of that fear. People being like, if you talk to them about sex, they're gonna run out and do it. And there's never been any evidence that finds that to be true. There's actually evidence that finds comprehensive sex ed delays young people's first intercourse, which for a lot of, adults, that's a plus. And also means they have more information when they actually do begin having sex. But there is no evidence that it just makes kids be like, oh, I literally never heard of that before. Because you also have to acknowledge we're living in like the age of everything being accessible information-wise. So it's very unlikely that the first time a young person is going to hear about sexuality, that it's happening in a classroom.
Had in fact started right around the time that I joined my youth group as a 7th grader. This movement saturated the lives of evangelicals, but that was really just the beginning. It entered into public schools, it entered into grassroots organizations.
I work with adults that were raised in purity culture as young people. And for a lot of them, that means that they did reach adulthood with no information about sex other than it was really bad and you shouldn't have it and it's only for husbands and wives. So that's like straight married Christian couples or straight married Jewish or Muslim couples depending on their background, because purity, the value of purity is found in all major world religions. Just depends on how fundamentalist you are with them. So when you are raised to believe that everything about sex is scary or bad or nobody's talking about it, that means that you can get to adulthood and have no information about your body, no information about your partners, no information about what you're even doing together, let alone being able to talk to your partner about this. And there's this promise that's made that's essentially like, well, when you get married, everything will just be good.
Let's fall on the bed again.
Yeah, you'll fall on the bed, the switch will flip, and you will know what you're doing. And that typically doesn't come to pass. So I do work with a lot of people who are like, my wedding night was terrible. Neither of us knew what we were doing, or in some unfortunate circumstances, there's a bit of coercion involved, and there's never been any consent conversation, because consent isn't taught in all sex education, let alone if you're being raised in a culture where sex is just purely bad. Consent is not typically part of that at all.
You're renting it presumably to masturbate to, right?
Good God.
Well, come on, don't be such a tight ass. We're all adults here.
I know I'm an adult. How old are you exactly?
I'll be 26 in March.
26, and you still haven't learned there are some things that are polite to talk about in public.
If it makes you feel any better, I mean, I do it like twice a day.
Good God!
Masturbation is such an interesting subject because everyone has the ability to feel pleasure in their bodies, and there's no meaning to that. We assign it a cultural meaning, like, oh my God, that's so bad, and that's really like, you shouldn't be doing that. Masturbation is one of those things that I've done like a lot of reading about this and educating my clients about this, but there have been, you know, in other cultures, it's not considered this terribly taboo thing. So imagine being told at 13 years of age or 15 years of age that it is a sin to touch yourself. That's something that is reserved for your husband, and if you're doing it now, you're like dishonoring him in some way. Like, that's truly what some people are taught about it. Other myths are that, especially for people with vulvas, if we're using vibrators, that it can somehow like make us desensitized to the sexual touch that happens from another person without a vibrator. So there's a lot of kind of fear-mongering among people about the use of sex toys, that like sex toys will damage or hurt us in some way. The rhetoric is most strongly directed at boys in these like religious circles, and I have worked with men who said that masturbation was such a taboo thing that they were in accountability groups where they had to like get together with their peers and a spiritual leader and like confess all of their sexual thoughts, feelings, anytime they touched themselves. And that they were just told that it was like a matter of, you know, being faithful to God, and literally the fear of God put in them about not touching themselves. So many men who were raised with these beliefs really still have trouble letting go of them. And for a lot of them, the messaging about masturbation is really deeply intertwined with messaging about pornography, and that its use is like absolutely never acceptable, and that any use, even casual use, is addiction, which is a whole other topic. I think the messaging is out there that sex is deeply tied to marriage, and especially because of the exposure I have to all of these religious traditions. You know, there's still so much messaging out there with the purity culture weight to it. And there's like a whole generation of purity influencers on TikTok and Instagram. So, you know, now it's not always the youth group leaders, it's these like young, beautiful, usually like white, blonde girls on Instagram and TikTok making reels about how important it is to save sex for marriage. And then sometimes they get married and then they start making their influencing about their really great marital sex life, but of course it's only for the married people. So I think that in our like overall American culture, we have really come to accept that sex and marriage do not have to be tied together, but there are still a lot of people who are really promoting that idea. I believe that, you know, when we fail to let people have all of the information that's relevant to them about sexuality, and when we fail to let people understand like the cultural context of things and to discuss and have feelings and share their thoughts and ideas about how relationships work and intimacy works, then we really do set people up to have problems with intimacy. And it doesn't matter really, like people of any sexual identity can fall into this, but it does land really heavily for like queer and trans people too, if we're not seeing ourselves represented like in the conversation or in the education at all.
Did you experience any fear, taboo, or stigma around masturbation?
Yes. It was not something, sexuality in my household was a no-go, like absolutely not. So it was very much like, no sexuality was allowed in my parents' household. So I did masturbate, but like completely silently under the covers, as quietly as I possibly could. And now I will shout masturbating from the rooftops. I would way rather have someone masturbate, or I would rather masturbate myself than have a non-consensual or unfulfilling sex with someone I don't give a shit about. I would rather perform my own pleasure than have to deal with all of that comes with, you know, going on a date with someone you don't like in order to fuck, and then it's, you know, you're going through those motions, where I would way rather masturbate.
I mean, there is taboo around masturbation, whether you're masc or femme presenting, and I personally, have never, as far as I know, I've had any taboos personally directed towards me. I think self-pleasure, again, is something we're all entitled to have. And just like we all use the bathroom, just like we all eat, people engage in these functions. Sometimes because they want to, sometimes because I want a second dessert, sometimes because I do want to masturbate for whatever reason.
Probably when I was younger. I was raised Catholic and religious, but honestly, as soon as I hit puberty, I just didn't care whether it was a sin or not. I was just like, this is just gonna happen. So the main thing I had shame about was trying to parse, because I'm bisexual, so it was more so when I was thinking of men, I would have the shame, but not the act itself that ever brought me shame.
Growing up Mexican American, there was almost always certainly jokes about it from family members, from uncles, oh, you old enough to masturbate yet? And it's kind of just a dig at me, but I guess it was also where is this kid growing up at? Where's his head at kind of check-in? So from that angle, it wasn't necessarily frowned upon, but it was also kind of a weird surveillance over me. I think, at the end of the day, I did kind of have to hide that stuff from my family, when I did masturbate, of course, just because I felt like we would be at odds. At least with my mom growing up Roman Catholic, it was, certainly frowned upon in that regard. But on the other hand, I had my father and my uncles who were kind of jesting about it, so it's growing up on two paths, and thankfully I've just sort of come down the middle of that one.
Do you believe it's stigmatized to have sex outside of marriage?
I think it is. And I think I consider myself single, solo, polyamorous. So I'm dating me and everyone else is a bonus, because I need to put myself first, because in my past, I've been a serial monogamous dater. And so I think for me, it's been able to be more present in what I want and allow myself to really stay true to who I am and what I want to do before I'm allowing my partners to influence where I'm at.
I think nowadays it's kind of expected, and it's kind of rare to still see people who hold out for marriage, and whether or not there's stigma. I certainly don't stigmatize people for it, and if they do, then that's on that person's that person's problem for stigmatizing another.
In certain areas, it is definitely stigmatized that way. This is being filmed in Philadelphia. This is where I'm from. It's a more liberal area, but people that I know from more down south or the Heartland area, they, or even just not in America. I was seeing one girl, she was from India, and she was taking that, it's night and day, the difference. A lot of people in my grad program for computer science were from India. They were also saying it's night and day. Everything is very repressed in certain parts of the world, and we probably shouldn't do that anymore.
And this is The Politics of Sex.